Okay, so last time, was anybody here last time? Okay, so last time I demonstrated an app called Flog, and Flog was essentially Flask, which is a web framework, a web application framework in Python, and some other tooling put together. Database, SQ Alchemy is a ORM, and essentially kind of put it together and showed some ways that some of the things you have to do to get Flask and SQ Alchemy working together if you want to test it well. And it's a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, but it's out there. And this code is on GitHub. If you go, DerbyPy has an organization on GitHub, and Flog is under there if you want to take a look at that code. I'm not going to rehearse anything really from last week. I just wanted to build, or I wanted to use the same app, and as I was beginning to set up a new app, I was like, I already did this for the last app, so I'm going to add some functionality here. And so my goal today is to add some really basic functionality to this application. But the way I'm going to do it, I'm going to demonstrate test-driven development. So in my world, a lot of times when I code, I will write the code before I write the test or I will write the test before I write the code that implements that functionality. And there's a lot of controversy, it seems like, if you read Hacker News or any of the other kind of hacker places that people hang out and can chat. I'm not really sure why there's so much controversy. There's certainly occasionally times where I find it valuable to write the implementation code first. But I'd say 70 to 80% of the time I'm writing tests first. And I like what it does in terms of making me think about my dependencies. And by that, I don't mean library dependencies. I mean dependencies for the function. It also makes me think about the API. Do I like the API? Do I like the way that it works? And I feel like as I build those pieces together, my code just ends out coming a lot cleaner than when I start from the other end in. And I've been doing this for about 15 years now. I started programming professionally in 2004, and I didn't start doing this this way until probably about 2010. So I've got 6 years of doing it one way and 7 years of doing it another. No, that's not right either. 6 years of doing it one way and 9 years of doing it another. I can say learning to code like this, it's different. It makes you think differently, and I think a lot of people don't like it because of that. It feels awkward for a bit, and it definitely slows down your productivity at first. And there is a lot of hype in the software world. It can be sometimes very difficult to figure out what matters and what doesn't. What should you actually implement? What shouldn't you? I said last week the last meeting that automated testing was one of those things that would pay off in terms of learning how to do it. I also think continuous integration is one of those things that absolutely makes your life a lot easier as a developer. It's worth setting that up. You can do automated testing and continuous integration, which runs those tests when you check in code, without ever doing test-driven development. Test-driven development is a way to go about writing your automated tests. But I would say, again, automated testing is something that, or test-driven development is something that if you learn how to do it, it will pay dividends, and it will make your code. What I have found is it just keeps my code cleaner, and it gives me. Have you ever been coding and just felt like I don't know what to do next? Like I have this big ball of twine in my mind, and I have a general sense of the direction I want to go, but I don't know where to start because it all feels like one thing's connected to another. And at least I feel like as a developer, when I'm in that mode, I'm incredibly unproductive. And I can stay there for hours sometimes if it's a decently complex problem where I'm just like, I do a little bit over here, do a little bit over here, and I realize I don't like that, so I start over here instead, and it just, it doesn't go very well for me. And I find that having a test-driven development mentality, I'm constantly asking myself, well, just write a test. Like, what do you think you want it to be? Write a test. But then the other thing that happens with test-driven development is that we do refactoring. And so once you start writing tests, as long as the test pass, you can go refactor the code and make it better. And so I have a very strong perfectionist tendency, and what test-driven development for me has allowed me to do is I don't feel bad just getting started, knowing that my tests are going to allow me to refine my code without accidentally breaking something. So as a developer, what I think testing does, and what test-driven development in particular does, is it gives me a significant sense of confidence to continually move forward and to continually make changes on my code without fearing that I'm accidentally breaking something. And when I take that fear out and I replace it with a high level of confidence that where I'm going is good, I find myself being just very, very productive in the amount of work that I get done, which I think we can all agree not only makes us feel good, but makes our employers or our clients, makes us a good investment to them, which is a net win for everybody. So that's why I'm teaching on test-driven development. That's why I practice it, and that's why I advocate for it as often as I have opportunity.
I'm sorry.
No, please.
When you're talking about I just write a test, I'm not getting a picture in my mind. Can you just give a short example?
I'm going to show you. So today is all about, we're going to add some functionality and we're going to do it in a test-driven development way. Any other questions? I'm happy to raise your hand or just speak up if you got questions. I'm happy to.
I just wanted to point out the obvious as well. When you have those tests, it's also helpful for other developers to know what your code's doing. And then when there is a bug issues, you can track it down so much quicker.
Yep, exactly. There's a bug, you write the test to reproduce the bug, and then you go fix the bug, and then all your tests pass, and then you deploy. We combine this with frequent automated deploys. They're not fully automated. We still have to kick them off, but it would be very easy for us to fix a bug and deploy and fix a bug and deploy and do that 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day. We have the test running, continuous integration in the background, and we can deploy as soon as the build is green and the PR is approved on GitHub. So it's a really nice, efficient, productive development model. Anybody else? Questions, comments, concerns? Okay. So this application that we built, the whole goal of this application is to never actually run it. So in test-driven development, a lot of times I can do the bulk of my development work and not even run the application. Now the tests are technically running it, but what I mean is I'm not turning it on, I'm not turning the web server on, I'm just continually iterating on my tests, and a lot of times I can build 80 to 90% of an application like that until I get to a point where web user interface really matters, and then I have to open a browser and see it. Maybe I'm tweaking CSS or whatever. Or if I'm doing JavaScript, then it's a whole different ballgame. But as long as you're staying in Python, it's generally how I'm doing it. So what we want to do today is we actually want to... Everybody know what Hacker News is? Anybody not know what Hacker News is? Okay, Hacker News is just I guess it's like a news website, like a news aggregator, but it has a tendency to be tech-oriented, and then there's usually a lot of comments, going on. And so a lot of times Hacker News, you read for the comments more than you read necessarily for the articles that they're linking to. But I read this 2-3 times a day just to see what's going on in the world. This is one of the sites that I use to try to kind of just stay updated with the community circles that I run in. I'm sure that there's other sites, specific to maybe .NET or whatever. This is not a Python-specific site. There's a lot of different things that are, they're on this site. But in general, this kind of tracks the open source software development side of the ecosystem. One of the things that we have here is users, and users have a thing called karma, which tracks. You get points when you post things or people upvote you. So it's, I don't know. I don't use Facebook. Is it kind of like Facebook? No, not really. All right. Well, this is what Hacker News is. Each profile each user has a karma score. You can go to their list of submissions. You can go to their list of comments. But this also has an API. And if I pull this up, if I pull up my own profile as a JSON document, you'll see that I have karma here. And then I also have a bunch of submitted IDs, and those IDs reference other items, and you have to understand a little bit about Hacker News and what an item is. An item could be a comment or a submission. I'm not going to go into that because it doesn't really matter. For our use case, I'm contemplating an application that if I gave it my Hacker News user ID, the application would go fetch the data from this API and simply show me the karma and the number of submissions I have. So pretty simple app that I'm contemplating, but it has some nice. There's enough trouble in this because we're using an external API that it gives us a good example here to start from. So I'm cheating a little bit because I've got some code here that I've written that's not currently active. That was just to keep me from having to fumble through and type all this stuff up while you all watched. And we'll see. I might do some of that later, and I might end up going back to where I've actually. So I worked through this all once, and then I deleted a bunch of stuff just to make sure that I knew what I was doing. But when I worked through it, I did do it in a test-driven development way. So now I'm just going to try to repeat that. And if it seems like I'm having a really hard time, I might go cheat and go back to what I had written and do some copy and pasting. But we'll see how that goes. So before I get into what this code actually does, I want to start with my test. And so I felt like this was a pretty good place to start. I'm using a test runner called PyTest. You can Google PyTest if you want to. PyTest allows us to run tests. And so it has what would you call it? An idiom, I guess, for how to define tests. Anything that starts with test is going to be run by is going to be gathered, and then those tests are going to be ran. And so that's what the class is by calling it test hacker news. Well, let me start with the file. So starting with the file, by having the file start with test libs hacker news, and then having the class start with test, and then having the method start with test, PyTest is actually going to execute this code for me. And there's going to be a lot of setup that it does for me, and we're not going to even worry about that for right now. We're really just going to focus on, okay, the tests are set up, they're running, Python is set up, it's running, the app's set up, and it's running, and now we just really want to think about how are we going to write our API? How is our app going to go out and get that information and present it? How are we going to do that? So in this code, let me close this. The way that I've structured this application is that we have some of the main files in the root directory, so app, CLI, views, they're all in the main directory, but then I have a libs directory where I put kind of secondary stuff, things that's not in every app. And I can just put files in there as needed. And my libs directory has a tendency to be very specific. So I created a file in here called hackernews.py. And that's where all of my logic related to Hacker News is going to live. Any questions so far? Okay. So before I go into that file, though, and to talk much more about it, I want to think about the test, or the API. What do I actually want the Python API to look like? I'm going to change this a little bit. So in Python, this line up here is how you import modules or import code from other areas of your application. And so my root application is Flog. I have a libs directory, and then I have a Hacker News module, is the Python term for this, in there. And so this is how, from a Pythonic perspective, I get access to the code objects that are in that file. So I import this module, and then I got to think about, well, what do I actually want to do with it? What would I want, if I had a Hacker News module, what would I actually want the API to look like? Well, I know that I need two pieces of data for the app that I'm building. The first one is karma, and the second one is, so I want the karma, and then the second one is this submitted array, and I just want to know how many objects are in it. That seemed, for our test purposes, that seemed legitimate. Obviously, if you were writing an app, you'd have a better perspective on what the requirements are, and you'd know what you needed to do, but for me, I just kind of came up with this. So it seems legitimate to me that I could ask for karma from this module, and I could ask for the sub count, which would be submission or submitted count. And then the only thing I need to feed it is, well, what's the user profile? Does that API seem pretty plain, simple, straightforward to everybody? Any questions about it? Okay, so in PyTest, I use assert to make sure that this value equals an expected value. And in many ways, this is very similar to what Nate just showed you. The difference is the Cohen's project uses Python unit test, which is built in to the Python library. Python standard library. I'm showing you how to do it with PyTest, so there's a little bit of a difference here, but it's the same principle. So from my perspective, I should be able to call .karma, since my karma is 394. I set it equal to that. I'm going to cheat a little bit here because you already know what that number is. I didn't know what the number was, and I didn't want to figure it out by counting the number of rows in this JSON. So what I decided to do is I'm just gonna write the code, and I'll let this test fail. And when the test fails, it will tell me what the actual number is, and then I'll just go plug it in. And that'll be a way for me to write my test. So let's go ahead and run these tests. So flog tests, and then PyTest, test libs hacker news. And we get a lot of errors. And that makes sense. We should get a lot of errors because this file doesn't really have anything in it yet. I've got some commented out code, but I've written the tests so they fail. And as Nate was saying, this is the red-green. If you hear red-green in testing, this is what it means. Failures are always red, and when we fix all those failures, they'll turn out green. One of the things that can be difficult when you're running tests like this is that there can be a lot of failures at once. So PyTest gives us a command line argument, -x, which tells it to fail after the first failing test. So if I've got 1,000 tests and I've done something wrong and like 300 of them are failing, it's impossible to debug all that. There's just too much output on the screen. So I can feed it -x as an argument, and then I'll just get one test, and I can slowly work my way through the problems, figuring out where is that core problem that caused all these tests to suddenly stop failing. So in actuality, when you start doing test-driven development, I will actually run tests where the code doesn't even exist, and the failure is there's no attribute karma. There's nothing in the Hacker News Python module called karma. So what are you calling? It's basically asking me there's nothing there. And that's okay. I actually do that. I wanted to do that. This is the red-green mentality. Test failures are good because they point you to what you need to do next. So I'm going to undo what I just did there. And you'll see that karma right now, it's not doing anything. And so we'll go back to the error that we had before, which is right here. This is the first thing I'm looking at. This is the line that matters most to me. Assert Hacker News karma r Syring equals 394. Okay, so that's failing. That's why it's showing up. And then the next line, I guess actually this line is the one that's most important to me because it's telling me this value is actually none. So I wanted it to be 394. The value is actually none. So that gives me the next step that I need to take as a developer. How do I get that to be 394? Well, I'm going to uncomment this code. We're using a library called requests to go ahead and get this data. It's a very handy library. You can read about it. I don't want to go into a request tutorial, so we'll just assume that it's working kind of like a browser. It's issuing a GET request, so it's taking the username that's fed it. It's splicing that into the string here. That's not right. Splicing. It's inserting, and we can actually use, now that we're on Python, we can actually Python 3.7. We can use string interpolation, which I like. And that should then get us a response object. Response objects have a JSON method. When you know you're dealing with JSON, you can call JSON. That will turn the string representation into the relevant Python objects. So user JSON is now this data translated into actual Python objects. I want to make sure that it's not none. It could be none. It very well could be none. So I want to make sure I handle that case. Actually, you know what? Let's take that out of there. So we're just going to do this. And so we're going to grab that user JSON dictionary, which is what the JSON object will be turned into in Python. It'll be turned into a dictionary. Some of you might know that as kind of a hash if you're coming from certain programming languages. We're going to extract karma from that dictionary and return it, and that should be an integer. So now that we have that code in place, so we wrote the test first. Now we went and wrote the code, the production code. Now we're going to rerun the test and see if it's fixed. Okay, so we could think, oh, we didn't fix the problem, but we actually did. If you notice, this line is not the same. This is subcount. This has moved on to the next failing test because I wrote 2 failing tests. So we actually accomplished what we set out to do. We made that test pass. Let's go. Let's just go kind of confirm that quick. And an easy way to do that would be to just make that test fail deliberately. And now I see that assert 394, which is the value that's actually coming back from the API request, I'm asserting that it's equal to 39, which is obviously not true. I get the test failure, and now I can come back to make it 394. Now, if you remember earlier, I said I didn't know what that number of submissions was, and I didn't want to sit there and count. So I just set it to anything, hoping that it wouldn't actually, accidentally hit on the one that it was. And so I'm going to run this test. And, okay, assert none equals 40. Okay, that's because subcount isn't implemented yet. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to implement it.
With the pass in there, was that supposed to make the test pass, or what exactly was that?
The pass in Python, you can't just define a function empty. You have to do something. And so pass basically is a syntactic way of saying don't do anything. But because of the way that Python is parsed, you have to have something there, some kind of expression. So I'm going to do user JSON submitted. So we had karma, and we have submitted. I'm actually deliberately creating an error here, but we're going to work through it through the test. Okay, and the error is, look, I'm returning a whole bunch of numbers. I'm actually returning the list. I forgot to count it. I forgot to just figure out what count it was, which is what I wanted to do. Okay, well that's what I wrote the test for. I wrote the test to help me prove the implementation. So I forgot something. No problem. You don't feel bad about that. You actually go, I'm glad I'm doing testing. And then you add length to that. And now we're going to get a different error, which tells us, hey, the number of records is actually 98, not 40. Well, in this case, we're just going to go back to the test and set it to 98 to make it pass, which is not what you do in real life, but we'll actually show you what you do in real life here in just a second. But just testing so far. Okay, and then I'm on to the test that I've got hidden here. So this test has now passed. I have 2 passing tests. See this? 2 passing tests, and I still have 1 failure, and we'll talk about. Yeah, and this. Okay, so any questions? Well, I would highlight it if I could. Any questions so far? Okay, so what's wrong with what's wrong with my tests here? What's difficult or what's going to be problematic about writing tests that actually hit code that goes out and hits a live API? The numbers could change a lot. The website could be down. The API could be down. In fact, if one of you had Hacker News open right now, you could go find something I've posted and hit the up button on it, and my tests would all instantly fail. So this is a very common problem for people who want to test, and that is, in my application, I often have a lot of things that are going on that are outside of my control. And so you have to learn what are the idioms, what are the methods for dealing with things like this. Sometimes, in the case of something like a database, I just clear the entire database and insert the data I want to be there before I run each test. So that's how I handle database stuff. But clearly with an external third-party API, I can't wipe their database and get the data I want in it. So that ends up usually using something called mocking in Python. In other languages, you might hear it also called stubbing. Or writing stubs. They have different meanings in a language like .NET or Java or C++, where you have stronger type requirements in the language. With Python being a very flexible language, we can like just go behind the scenes and munge stuff and just make it what we want it to be, which can be problematic if you do it too much, but it can be really nice. And so in Python world, we just mock stuff. And if you write your mocks correctly, it can end up being a nice a very helpful way of getting data to look the way that you want it while you're testing, and so that you're not hitting, live things that you don't control. So that's actually what we're going to do. That's actually what we're going to do next. Recognizing that we have written some tests that are going to be unstable, we want to write some tests that are not unstable. The other thing that we recognize as I was writing these two tests, I realized, wow, I've got a whole bunch of code duplication there, don't I? And if I wanted both karma and the sub count, which I am going to want, by the way, because my goal here is to produce a sentence that says this Hacker News user has X karma and blank number of submissions. Well, I don't need to make 2 API calls for both pieces of data, do I? I really need to make 1 API call and get 2 pieces of data from that returned value. So as I'm writing my tests, I'm realizing this implementation isn't great. I think I'm going to write a different implementation. Now that I have this working, I'm seeing some patterns in my code where there's duplication, and that helps me to understand I need to refactor. I need to do something a little bit different. So I'm going to go write some tests, and now I'm going to use a class. And what I'm thinking is I'll use a class, and that class will get the username, and then that class will just go get the API, make the API request once, and then I'll get the data out of that API request that I need. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm getting the, let's actually change, well, we'll leave it. So I'm getting the user our Syring, and I'm testing that I've got the numbers that I want, and with the goal that the way that I implement this is only going to go fetch the data once. So we'll go back here, and we'll see that the first test that's failing is name HN is not defined. That's the first thing. That's the first problem that I have. Well, that's because I stopped using the abbreviation, and I need to fix them. Okay, so now it's working. And user object has no attribute karma. Okay, that's because the user class is there, but nothing else is there. So let's go make that implementation, knowing that I have 394 and 98 that should be returned if it's working correctly. So I have a getJSON method here. Seems pretty straightforward to me. I'm just going to do this. And the error was karma is not defined, right? Okay. So now I'm going to do self.hnData for Hacker News data equals self.getJSON. So I'm making 1 API request, and then I'm saving it locally on the class so that I can use it later. And then I'm going to set self.karma equal to self.hnData karma. So now I've got a karma on the class instance. Does that make sense? Anybody got questions about this?
For the self.hnData, are you creating a variable right there?
The hnData?
Yeah.
I am, right here. Yep. So the very first thing that happens when that class gets instantiated is that we go ahead and fetch the JSON, and we store it in a local instance variable so that I can. Yes. In Python, dunder init. So when you see 2 underscores like that on either side, that's called dunder. So dunder init is essentially a constructor. It's not technically because the class already exists, but it operates in that fashion. And then I'm creating the karma that I need. That's going to pass. The next line is going to fail. Oh, nope. GetJSON missing 1. Oh, sure. Okay, great. So GetJSON needs to be passed username. Good. User object has no attribute subcount. That's what I was waiting for. So essentially the same thing here. Length of this array. Oh, you're right. All right, so this is test data. Yep, okay, good. So I'll show you why that error is there. But the point is the test that we were just testing is not the one that failed anymore. We've moved on to test data. So that tells me that test live is working, which is the one I was working on, and now I've got test data, which is not operating like I want it to. I wouldn't write test live and test data. I had done a little bit of work and saved it just for speeding up the class, but normally I would write test live and that would be the only thing. And so I would see when I was done with my test, we've been getting all red, but when I was done with my test, it would look like this, 3 passed. And I would continually iterate red, green, red, green, red, green. Sometimes it's red, 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 green. But that's essentially what I'm trying to do as I work through my problem set. Okay, so now one of the ways that I could work around my class actually going out and hitting live data is I could set up that class so that I could feed it the data that I want to from a testing perspective. So I could load that data as from the test side of things. You would never do that in production, but from testing we can certainly, if you think about it this way, like if you think about a ship, they have they're not ports, but they're hatches. There's hatches throughout the ship that you can open to essentially get into a part of the ship that is otherwise inaccessible because of the way that the ship has been constructed. And they do that for maintenance and other reasons. And so that's essentially what we're doing. We're creating a hatch in our test, or in our class, to feed it the data that we want to so that we can test the rest of the class without hitting that external dependency. Because if you think about our implementation, right now we're just pulling a couple variables out. But a lot of times, in the grand scheme of things, if I'm going to go fetch some data from a third party, I might make 1, 2, 3, even 10 requests. But the bulk of the work that I'm doing to put that data into the way that I want it is all local. It's just having that third-party dependency is really irritating. So I want to make a really easy way to feed it the data that I want to so I can easily test the functionality without complicating it with that third-party external access. And so we're going to set up a test here, which allows me to feed the data that I want in. So I'm going to do an underscore in Python. Something with a leading underscore essentially means it's kind of private. It's not really private in the way that it would be for Java or .NET. You can still access it, but it's an indication of intent on the part of the developer that variable is a little bit special. And so this pattern is common. I want to give it the data that it sees, and then I'm going to test to make sure that the data that comes out of it matches what I passed in. Does that make sense? Anybody wonder why I would do this? Does this seem kind of stupid or self-defeating? Why would you pass data in and then test it immediately that's what it is?
Well, then you don't have to worry about getting the data. You can work on that later.
Yeah.
Making the data look the way you need it.
Exactly. Yep. Okay, good. So we'll run this test, and it's going to fail because 394 is not equal to 123. And so the problem right now is, can somebody tell me? What's the problem? We haven't actually implemented anything with user data yet. So it's still going out and hitting the live API and giving me the 394 that's coming from the API instead of the 123 that I'm submitting here. So in order to get that to work, I'm going to say underscore user data equals to, or self.getJSON. So this is just a Boolean operation, and user data by default is none. So in production, this is going to be none, and then it's going to set itself to what self.getJSON actually goes and fetches. But when I set it in a test, then it will automatically use that value. This value will evaluate to true, and so it won't even execute self.getJSON. Great. So now we have four past tests. And we're going to now look at a CLI command. So a lot of times when I'm writing something like this, I want to try to actually get an easy way to run that library. So I deliberately built that code in a library that is context agnostic. That library functionality that I built It doesn't care if it's operating in a web environment. It doesn't care if it's operating in a CLI environment. It doesn't care if it's getting kicked off by a Celery task. It just doesn't care. It does its work based on the parameters that are passed in and nothing else. It's not a pure function because it hits an API. But I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. And as opposed to, for instance, putting that functionality all in like a web view where I'm pulling the username out of the request object, from like a form submission or something. Okay, so let's see. What do we want to do? I want to test the CLI. And so Flask, the web framework that I talked about that this is built on, gives me the ability to attach web command or CLI commands to the application. And so my idea is I want to create an hn-profile command that will take the name of the user, profile of the username, and create a sentence for me telling me how many submissions it has and the number of karma. So this is the very first kind of real implementation that I'm trying to do here in terms of having a CLI command that I could actually execute and see how it works. So again, I'm not going to run the CLI command directly. I could. I'm going to write the test first. So this runner thing here is something. This is all stuff that Flask provides. This runner gives me a way to essentially tie into the CLI application, part of the application programmatically. I need to tell it what args I'm running. And so the args, the way that I want this to run is I'm thinking in my mind, I want to be able to run this command. And when I run this command, I want it to spit out user R Syring has submitted 98 things and has a karma of whatever. That's the command I'm thinking about building. So I use the code, or I use the runner to run to invoke the command, and then I assert that the output of that command on the CLI on standard out is equal to the sentence that I want it to be, and that's and that's the first test. This is the first CLI test that I write. Any questions about that? Okay. So, okay, my Libs Hacker News was just for the library code. I've written a different test file for the CLI code. I like to keep my stuff segmented. Oh, fine. This application actually has a database connection, not for what we're doing, but for what existed previously. So it was yelling at me because it couldn't find the PostgreSQL server. Okay, so now what we're being told is we were looking for this line, and what we actually got was an empty string. We basically got nothing in the output. It ran, there was no errors, but I just didn't get any output. Again, looks a little bit different because I wanted to get some of this skeleton in place. But if we were really to do this completely from scratch, that's actually what I would do first. And I would see that the app doesn't even know about an HN profile command because it doesn't exist from its perspective. Then the next thing I would do is come in here and I would write the code to get the command to make it exist at least. I wouldn't write any of the functionality. And then I would come back and I'd run it again and make sure, okay, great, now I have a different error. I at least know now that the CLI integration is working correctly. And now we're going to write some code to make this happen. So, stop using abbreviations. And again, just like we did in our test, we've imported this module, the Hacker News module. And if you remember, the way that we used it was we instantiated the user class. We fed it the username. Let's see, what did we want the sentence to say? So turn that into the same sentence. and have to replace this with username. User.subcount and user.karma. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Let's see if our test passes. Great, test passed. That's exactly what I wanted. Now, I should be able to test it for real. Great. That's exactly what we expected it to say. Anybody else have a Hacker News profile? No? I could put your name in there. There we go. King Kong has 12 submissions and 10 karma. So we know it's working, right? So this is my first, I actually have a user interface into that library, and it works. So I validated that my tests are doing the right thing. There's sometimes when you're doing test-driven development where your tests will work, but then you actually go to use it and you realize, oh, I didn't really think through how I wanted this to work, and then you need to go back and change your tests too. That's okay. That's how it works. The whole point is the tests give you a way to operate on this stuff. And we'll talk about. I'll add to that in just a little bit. Let me finish that thought here in just a second. So, what's the problem with this test? Not that test. That's the implementation. What's the problem with this test? We're back to hitting the live API again. We're back to hitting the live API. And if somebody goes and changes, gives me an upvote or a downvote, this is going to break. And I'll tell you, if you're trying to advocate for tests in your organization and you have flaky tests that break sometimes easily, people are going to hate testing. They don't really hate testing, they hate bad tests. And flaky tests are bad tests. So don't write flaky tests. So that means we need to do something in this test to set up the data that we want. We need to do something to put the data in there so that it's not hitting the live website anymore. It's just like this. We fed this user data in here. We need to somehow do that with this functionality. Unfortunately, because of the way this is implemented for us, we don't have access to this hackernews.user object. So we're just calling the CLI command. We're very much removed from this code running. And so we could do some hacky things to maybe try to get into this and change it. But there's actually a tool called mock that's going to help us a lot. And so I'll show you a little bit how to use mock. So mock is going to give us the ability to go in and essentially kind of replace an object. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to go into this Hacker News file, and we're going to grab this getJSON method off of this class, and we're going to replace it with an object that's really flexible that I can set values on. Because all I really need to do is make it stop making this request. I want it to not make that request, and instead I want it to return a dictionary that I have control over.
You're basically mocking the request.
I'm mocking the request out. That's exactly what I'm doing. So I take out the network request, and I take out the conversion of JSON to Python object, and I just insert that Python object as a return value. So that's what I'm going to do right here. I use mock.patch. You can, the mock is part of the standard library. You can just Google Python mock and learn how to use it. This, as a decorator, as a Python decorator, this code is actually kind of wrapping this function. And part of the wrap is it's going to add that mock object to the arguments to this method. And so that's where mgetJSON comes from. You can name this whatever you want to. I could name this Pizza Hut, and it would be a Pizza Hut variable. But it's really, you can do like 3 or 4 mocks. So it's really like, it's just putting them in position based on, when you use them. So mgetJSON, the M underscore is my nomenclature. That's something we use at level 12. Maybe, I don't know if you guys use it, but I use it to indicate that this is a mock parameter. And then I call it the same name as whatever I'm mocking. So this is a really easy way for me as a developer to know, it's mocking the getJSON method. So I mock it, and I set its return value to this. I set its return value to that dictionary. And so when this class executes in the test, when this class is instantiated in this test and in this test only, because the mock implements itself, it starts when that test method starts, and then it cleans up after itself when that test method ends. And so it's only gonna apply, this mock is only gonna apply while test HN profile mock method is running. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? So I'm going to replace that value, I'm going to run it, and now instead of it saying Hacker News user R Syring has 98 submissions and 394 karma, it's going to say 3. It's not. Actually, it's going to give us an error. Let's see that. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Oh, really? Oh, that's right. Okay, it has 3 submissions because there's 3 items in my array or in my list. This is a list in Python, and then karma is 1, 2, 3. I had them juxtaposed there. So this test passed. Any questions on this? Okay, and then we can do the exact same thing in a web view. So now I'm thinking not only would I like this application to work on the command line, but I'd like it to have a page that comes up and says, hey, tell me your Hacker News username, and I put it in there and I hit submit, and then it comes back and shows me basically the same data that I just saw in the CLI. But again, the point is I can put it in a web context instead of being in a CLI context. So I already have some of this set up for us just to save some time. Again, I've mocked out this value. I've set the value there. Now this client is something that I have set up. Flask gives us the ability to have a browser-like object that's attached to the app, and we'll query it just like a browser would. So when I do client.post, that app is being instantiated, and I'm making a post request to the app just like a web browser would. Or up here, when I do client.get, it's making a GET request of that resource just like a browser would if a browser was hitting the application instead. So knowing that a web form has a GET to load the form and then it has a POST to submit the data, I've got 2 tests. One here gets the URL HN. I check for a 200 response code, and I'm looking in the HTML for please enter your Hacker News username. And then I would assume that if I post a username to that same URL, that I'm then going to get the response that I got on the CLI. It should be the same thing as I got on the CLI. Does that make sense why I wrote these tests this way? And again, I would do this in real life. I would actually go through and write tests just like this and then go implement the views for it. So let's just do the get so that we have the benefit of red, green. And what?
Are you mocking the get request?
I'm not, because I'm not actually getting any data. So for the get, all it's doing is showing me the form to enter my information. It's not making an API request, so I don't need to mock it. It's only going to make the API request once it knows what the username is. I guess, did I close views? Okay. So we'll... Yeah, there's still a request response. No, because the request response is to my local app here. Okay, so we're going to call this HN, and then we're going to return, please, and we'll just copy it here. All right, so let's get our red. So now we're going to test views, and we have red. Why? Because we got a 404 instead of a 200. My Flask application doesn't know about a URL /hn yet. So it's returning a 404 like a proper application should. I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, so I'm going to create that view. Now that route exists. This is how we do it in Flask. This is the route. This is where it's defined, and then this is the function that's going to execute when that route is actually hit. And it should just return that value in a browser. So if you were to open this up in a browser, there'd be no HTML or anything. It would just be a string in your browser. It would be a text document. Okay? So, so great. So I've got the form. Theoretically, in a real world, this would be a form, and it would be in a template, and there would be all kinds of other stuff going on. But same principle. And now I want to test the mock, or I want to test the post. So I create the mock. I set up the mock to make sure that we don't go hit Hacker News. So we are going to hit our local Hacker News web application, but when that application is working, it's not going to go out and hit Hacker News, the Hacker News API. So we've got the client.post here. So notice this is get versus post. Same URL. Pass in the data. So this is the post data. It will turn it into the same format that you would if you had an actual form there and was posting the data. Reassert that response to status code equals 200, and then I should have the same message in the data. So I had green, now I'm going to have red. 405 equals 200, method not allowed. That's because by default, Flask does not allow you to post to a view unless you make that explicit. So I'll go ahead and do that. Now I could go ahead and write the rest of this view, but I'm not going to. Again, I'm using red-green, so I want to make sure that did what I thought, and it did. So now it's yelling at me because the response is not there like I thought it would be. And in order to get a hold of request data in Flask, you use globals that Flask manages the state on that to make sure that the global that you're using is always aligned with the thread or the process that your code is running in. So I can do if request dot method equals get. Else. We're going to assume it's post because I've only allowed two methods. I can do an if-else here. If I was, letting them do options or something like that, I would need to do an if-else here, but I'm not. So then I have to think about, what's going to happen if I do have a post? Well, there should be a username equals request.form username. And then I should be able to do profile. Actually, I think we used user. User equals hackernews.user and feed it the username. So now this code is looking really similar to what? It's looking really similar to what we did in the CLI for the CLI command. And then I'm going to return. And as I'm thinking about that, I'm like, you know what? I'm not even going to bother. I'm just going to copy and paste this. Change the print to a return. Username, user. Oh, that won't work. Okay. So now I think that's actually going to work. And my test passes. Any questions? So now you could do other things like, okay, I just copy and pasted almost verbatim that string that I wanted to use, right? And so now I'm thinking, well, why don't I just make that a property on that Hacker News user? Why don't I let it format what I would want a user to look like? And then the CLI and the view, the web view, they could both change their implementation. So I'm refactoring now, and if my tests are all correct, or if my implementation is correct, my tests should all pass, but I've cleaned up my code base a little bit. and I'm pretty certain I'm not breaking anything. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to run all my tests. I want to make sure that I haven't missed anything. Great. So I've got 12 tests. They're all passing. Okay, so now I'm in refactor mode, and I'm thinking, I don't really think I want to do that anymore. It seems kind of ridiculous that I'd have to do all that. So I want to go back to my library, and I want to say, okay, here, look. If you do test string representation, and I do this, I should be able to assert that the string value of our Syring is equal to, stop it, is equal to this. Any questions about why I wrote the test this way or what I'm doing here? Okay, this is going to fail because that class isn't implementing a string view yet that does those, that formats it that way. So instead of getting a nicely formatted string, I'm getting this thing, which is Python's way of saying, hey, you have this object type with a memory location of this. So that's Python's standard string representation of a user-defined or a programmer-defined class. That's what it's going to look like. But I can customize that, which I'm going to do now. Dunder string.
Itself similar to like this.
Yep. Yeah, and it's actually passed in, unlike it just being kind of hanging around and grabbing it. Yeah, it gets passed into each method. And I need self.karma. Okay, so now I'm going to, I got to do that one too. All right, so I think that looks good. Oh, user has no username. Okay, so we got to store that username now. Before, all we need to do is feed the username to get JSON. Now we need to keep it around for the formatting. So we'll just save that on the class instance. And now our test passes. Great, so now this test is passing, but we still have code duplication. So let's go clean up that code duplication. So now I should be able to just print user instead of having to do all that code formatting myself. So let's go test the CLI since that's the file we just changed. Great, it passes. And look in views. Let's return user. And we'll test views. Okay, so Flask doesn't want us to just pass anything back. It requires a string, so we can forcefully coerce or cast that object to a string. The print did it automatically for us. Print did an implicit cast, and now we've got test views passing. So we refactored our code, but we didn't touch our tests. If you remember, I didn't touch test CLI and I didn't touch test views. I just changed the implementation, and that's the whole point. The whole point is that as long as the view is still doing what it needs to do and the CLI code is doing what it needs to do, I can change the implementation, and that allows me to make my code better as I see patterns. And even more than that, it gives me confidence that when I'm writing something, I don't feel like it has to be perfect. I can go ahead and be a little bit sloppy. I can do the obvious sloppy thing knowing that my tests are going to back me up and I can come back and clean it up later if I have time. Or I can maybe create an issue, say, hey, this had to get out there, I got it out there, but we need to come back to this in our next maintenance window and refactor some of this stuff because there's a lot of duplication. Questions?
So you haven't pulled up your web application to look at it in the browser.
Okay. flog. If I run flog, it gives me a number of commands I can run. One of them is run the development server. This all comes from Flask. Flog run, localhost 5000. I don't have a default route, and so this was one I did earlier.
Can you go to your HN route?
I can, but I don't have the form or anything set up.
So that's where my question lies, right? So you've got all these passing tests, right? But you don't have a form, and so even though you could post the data, the user doesn't have a means of doing that.
Correct. So I wanted to try to keep this tutorial simple. There's actually a different library that I can use to access the app that has a form functionality in it, where you actually do like response.form, and then you set variables in the form, and it takes care of all the HTML parsing. It's called Web Test. I just didn't want to set all that up and confuse things. But yes, you're exactly right. And you can do that, right? You can do a bunch of TDD and end up with something that's not quite functional. But that's why we also do QA. Like, this is not all you do, but the difference is, as opposed to a developer, instead of spending most of my time refreshing a browser page and trying to set up data, I spend 80 to 90% of my test writing automated tests. Then I spend 10 to 15% of my time doing QA at the end, and then maybe even pass that off to a QA person or what we call project advocates for them to run through it once. Because as a developer, there's still a lot of things and assumptions I'm making about how things work because I built it. And so it's always good to have somebody who didn't build it at least do a little bit of QA and find some of those idiosyncrasies. I would never actually commit this code and push it up until I had opened it up in a browser and ran through it at least once to make sure I wasn't. Yep, exactly. Yep. Yeah.
So, put you on the spot here a little bit. Could you talk through perhaps how this might be useful in a database, like for a data science context, maybe in terms of detail or cleaning up data as it's coming through?
Yeah. So, my experience with data really ends at ETL. I've not done much with. Extract, transform, load. So a lot of times, anytime you're working with data, there's usually a lot of prep work that has to be done to take data from this system, clean it up, take data from that system, clean it up. Well, maybe it's not in the right format, so I have to transform it. So I'm extracting it from one system, I'm transforming it somehow, and I'm loading it into a different system, preparing it for whatever kind of analytics or whatever I'm doing. So. Well, I'm making it tidy, but I'm also sometimes even changing the nature of the data. So for instance, an operational database will often be normalized. So I might have a user table, and then when I have orders, my orders doesn't actually duplicate that user information. It just has an ID, user ID 327, and then that points to a record in the user table. Well, from an operations perspective, that makes a lot of sense. But when you start doing data analytics, that can be really difficult to work with because it's slow to do all those joins. And so we might denormalize part of that transform process might be to denormalize that data. You might also put it in different data formats. So third normalized form is one way to structure your data. A star schema is a different way to structure it that's very geared towards, reporting, of various types. Is that helpful? In that type of environment, the question is, how do you know that your extract, transform, and load actually handled your data right? I mean, sometimes you have multi-million-dollar decisions being made on this data, and it may not be loading correctly. You may not have transformed it correctly. Are you testing your data pipelines? And so you can absolutely, it's not going to look like this because you're not going to have Flask involved in something like that usually, but you could certainly use PyTest. You could certainly write your extract, transform, and load in Python, and then, or any other language really that you can write tests for, and then set up some tests to make sure that as data works its way through that pipeline, it does what it should do. And we do that. We have one of our clients that we manage the operational database and we manage the analytics database in a star schema. And I don't know how many tests are in there now, but thousands. I mean, we have thousands and thousands of tests in that data transformation process to make sure that we're moving the data from one database to the other database and not making like, oops, I created 2 order records for every order. Oh, we're doing great this year. Like, our orders went up 100%. Well, they're going, yeah, but we're not really seeing that. We're not seeing that in the accounting. Like, where's all the money? And, they start to put things together. Like, they shouldn't have to do that. Your people who are using your data should be really confident that what they're getting is clean and well managed. And I think tests go a long way. I mean, we do a lot of changes in that as they ask for changes or updates or new stuff. And so testing that stuff is just really important. And I think it's something that's often overlooked in the industry. I've never talked to anybody else that tests a data pipeline like we do. Have you? And I go to conferences and talk to people about what they test. I just don't test it. Anything else? Okay. Thanks for coming. I am going to dismiss us. If you're interested, have questions, feel free to come on up. I'll hang around for a bit in case you got any personal questions that maybe aren't as fit for the group. Thank you.